consumers is how much profit they gained. All the profits added to producers, gained by the producers, represents their well-being. I personally like producers more than consumers because producers are much simpler. They only care about money, so it's really easier to understand their behavior. But consumers, much more complex. When you add a tax, however, situation changes. Let's say you add this much tax. Now, this difference here is the tax. Let's say this is $100. We talked about how we lost this part because consumers left the market. We lost this part because producers had to reduce their production, and the remaining parts, as you can see here, are consumer surplus and producer surplus. The remaining parts here. This is the price paid to the producers or gained by the producers. And this is the price that consumers pay from their pocket. So everything above it is their surplus. This area is our consumer surplus, and this area will be our producer surplus. This is our deadweight loss. This is just what we have lost from taxing this market because people left the market. And this area here, this is all the money that goes to the government. This is the tax revenue. The upper side, this part, is the tax paid by customers, the burden of the tax, which is on the customers' shoulders. And the lower part is the burden of the tax that is on the producer's shoulders. And this is how you basically analyze taxation. Now, this is quite, could be a little hard. If you understand what does every part of this curves mean, you can have a much better, much smoother learning, but it could be hard. So if you have any questions, that's perfectly fine. Go ahead and ask. Any questions? No questions. Okay. This we talked about. C plus E is called the deadweight loss of the tax, the fall in total surplus that results from the market, from a market distortion. Government is interfering in the market. There will be a deadweight loss here. Now, with all that background, we can now do this whole example. Last time we did part A, so now let's do only the important part, which is part B. If a $100 tax per ticket is imposed, compute consumer surplus, producer surplus, tax revenue, total surplus, and deadweight loss. You have 5 minutes. Let's go. Make sure you do this. These are, well, this is definitely one of your exam questions. So get this under control now, and you'll have a much easier time later. This and next chapter are one of the hardest things you have to deal with in this course. So spend time on this, 5 minutes. See you in 5. Let's begin. The first part we did last time is just supply demand equilibrium. That should be easy. The second part, how much is the price paid by customers? This is the tax, 100. Judging by the elasticities of these two, yep, should be exactly. Do we have this price? Remember, there is a video. If you're struggling how to do this kind of questions, there is a video I put on YouTube, and I walk through every single step on how to do this. You can always go back and check that video. You need to be able to find one of these points. The quantity will be here. If you have one of these points, the other one, you just add the tax amount and you can have it. For example, if I have this point here, I know that the tax will be $100. I would assume the tax is imposed on customers or producers. It won't make a difference. You will have the same numbers. Back to chapter 6. Now, you have 75 here, 250 here, and 150 here. Tell me the consumer surplus. Can anyone find the consumer surplus? This is 400. And this is 0. I can't write down 0 for some. 0. Can anyone tell me the consumer surplus? Consumer surplus 5,625. How do we have this number? This area is 150. That is the height of this triangle. We're looking for this triangle. We have the height. We have the base, which is 75. And the area of this triangle. Perfect. Thank you. That would be our consumer surplus, this area here. Now, the same method, you can find the producer surplus. You have 100 tax here. That is for every unit that is sold. 75 units are sold. If you pay $100 for each of these 75, how much money the government would gain? If you pay $100 for each unit and there are 75 units, how much money goes to the government? Thank you. Exactly. That would be our tax revenue, this area here. And how much did we lose? How much welfare or surplus did we lose by taxing people? You have this area here. The base of this triangle is 100. The height of this triangle is this much. 75, I think it's 100. Yes. 75 till 100. Therefore, it's 25. 2,500. That's 2,500 divided by 2, which is 1, 2, and 50. Is this correct? This is our deadweight loss. Is there any questions? I understand the calculations could take you a longer time, but make sure you're getting it. If you have any questions, ask. This question will appear on your final exam. Of course, it won't be as easy as you can see here. I'd like to make you say a few nice words about me on your time. So I'll make it a little harder. But if you have any questions, now is the time to ask. All clear? All right. Later, if you have any questions, you can email me. Now, what decides the deadweight loss? What factors influence how much money, how much people would leave the market? Most important one, price elasticities. How much do people need to be in the market? Do the people really need this market to be able to stay in it? Or not really, they could just switch to something else. This is very important, especially right now. Like 50 years ago, people were more tied to the place that they were living, so governments could afford to tax them. But now it's not really like that. Now you have this issue that some countries are taxing people a lot, which makes, especially like for European countries, the rich in European countries, the high income parts of the population have to pay really high taxes to be able to, so that the government can fund their social welfare programs. But then in the United States, not really. You don't need to pay that much taxes. If you're a billionaire compared to France or England, you're paying far less taxes. So what happens is that all those rich people from Europe move to United States, which makes the Europeans really angry. Even within United States, you have high tax states like California or New York, and you have low tax states. I think North Carolina is one of the low tax states. I'm not sure. So what you have here is that rich people from right now from New York are moving out. Even though New York is one of the best, like at least for the high income, like one of the best places to live, like cultural, artistic, the financial capital of the world, you name it. But still, because of this, now that people can afford, their elasticities are now much higher. Now they can afford to move out, which actually a few months ago, I think the governor of New York was actually talking about how we have to think about something to keep these people in the States, keep them from leaving. So that weight loss becoming really important. Price elasticities of supply and demand, more elastic supply curve would lead to a larger dead weight loss. When people are more, when their supply or their demand is more elastic, dead weight loss would be bigger. If you look at here, for example, now just a question. What kind of curve has higher elasticity? The flat curve or the vertical curve? Which one has higher elasticity? This curve or this curve? Just to see if you remember. Are these elastic or inelastic? Compared to this curve? Yes, inelastic. The more vertical a curve is, it's more inelastic. It means people needed more. The more flat or the flatter a curve is, that means it's more elastic, that people can afford to move out. If you look at here, for the same amount of tax, this is the dead weight loss. But here, dead weight loss is only this big. So if you can see, this one has a much bigger dead weight loss. This is the mathematics behind this. And theoretically speaking, this makes perfect sense. When I tax something, if people don't really need that thing, they would leave that market. But if people need it, they would stay. For example, this is what I'm going to say. Tax on cigarettes and now marijuana, illegal, like legalization of marijuana, because people need them. If you're addicted to cigarettes, you can't really just stop using cigarettes. You need to keep consuming cigarettes. So governments keep putting a tax on cigarettes and increasing this tax, and they say that it's for public health. But in reality, they know that no matter how much tax they add, people who are addicted to cigarettes just have to keep buying and buying and buying. Those who are cigarette smokers, addicted is not a really nice word. Those who are cigarette smokers, they have to buy and keep buying and buying and buying. Why? Because their demand is very inelastic. We saw this in chapter 6. But for example, if you add the same tax to say something normal, something that is not really inelastic. So breakfast cereal. If you add the same tax to breakfast cereal, which is here, people would just leave the market. They don't need to keep consuming. They would switch to something else, eggs and bacons. They don't really need it because it's elastic. More elastic would lead to a larger deadweight loss, whether it's on the supply side or the demand side. The same also applies to demand side, to the supply side. If the producer can only produce a certain good, then he or she cannot leave the market really easily. For example, if you're, let's say, if you're a chemist and your whole, like your expertise is on chemistry, and the government suddenly puts a tax on chemical production or chemical research, things like that, you can't really change. But if you're a software programmer, a computer programmer, and the government suddenly puts a tax on, let's say, video games, you'll quickly move towards designing antiviruses or software as like security softwares. Your hands are not really tied, you're elastic, so you could change your supply. More elastic supply curve would lead to a larger deadweight loss. The greater the elasticity of supply and demand, therefore, the greater the deadweight loss of a tax. Here you can see this. We covered this with that, which I drew. When supply is inelastic, it's harder for firms to leave the market. When the tax reduces price received by the supplier, so the tax only reduces quantity a little, and deadweight loss is small. The more elastic is supply, the easier for firms to leave the market. The greater quantity falls below the surplus maximum quantity or the equilibrium quantity, the greater would be the deadweight loss. Sometimes, in fact, most times, you may have elastic supply and inelastic demand. So, for example, let's say you're let me make it more obvious. This would be your supply curve. Well, this is your demand curve. For example, for some luxury good, let's say this is for the luxury boat market. Those who produce it, sorry, did the opposite way. For a luxury, luxury good, demand is very elastic. People don't need it, don't really need to buy luxuries. If the price changes, they could easily leave the market. But suppliers are different. They need it. They are actually working. They invested their money and their time into producing this good. They gained experience. They cannot overnight change. So when you add a tax, we talked about this, that the burden of the tax would fall mainly on the producer. That's why taxing luxury goods are not really popular. The argument behind it was that if you tax luxury goods, people who buy them, they can easily afford to pay them, but the reality is different, is that they won't pay a big share of that tax, and the biggest part of the burden would fall on producers, this part. And this total area would be our deadweight loss. This is the tax paid by the producer, and this would be the tax paid by the consumers. So you can see that the people who consume luxuries are paying a far smaller part of the tax. The more elastic is demand, the easier for buyers to leave the market like a luxury, the more quantity falls, the greater the deadweight loss. Now, this is a very nice question. Would the deadweight loss of a tax be larger if the tax were on breakfast cereal or sunscreen, hotel rooms in the short run or hotel rooms in the long run, groceries or meals at fancy restaurants? We're going to debate. I need you to give me your opinion on each one of them. You have 5 minutes to think about each one of these, and then we're going to talk about it. Please get active. Remember, you have to compare their elasticities. For example, breakfast cereal is much more elastic. The demand side is much more elastic than sunscreen because there is not really a substitute for a sunscreen. But breakfast cereal, lots of substitutes. People can switch to something else. For these other two, I would need your opinion. See you in 5 minutes. We're solving a second exercise. Okay, first part. Would the deadweight loss of a tax be larger if the tax were on breakfast cereal or sunscreen? If you were a politician and you wanted to impose a tax on each one of these, which one would you choose to have the smaller deadweight loss to keep the people in the market? Would you impose it on breakfast cereal or sunscreen? Anyone? Sunscreen. Yep. Because you can't really not buy sunscreen. You can always switch from breakfast cereal to some other source for your breakfast. But when it comes to sunscreen, you still have to keep buying it because there is not like real substitute for it. Hotel rooms in the short run or hotel rooms in the long run? The deadweight loss would be larger in the short run or in the long run? Anyone? Long run. Yes. In the long run, people have time to think, to plan, to prepare, so they will have a higher elasticity. Both the supplier and the consumers. They have more time to think, so they'll react. Now, this part, part C is very important. Groceries or meals at fancy restaurants? Which one has a higher deadweight loss? Has a bigger deadweight loss, larger deadweight loss? Anyone? Fancy restaurants. Yes, exactly. Fancy restaurants, well, they're not exactly luxuries. We all go there, so not really too often. But then the thing is, we don't have to. So if the tax is imposed on fancy restaurants, people will go there less often. But groceries, we all need them. We all would need to buy our groceries. So if you increase the taxes on groceries, people would still have to buy them. But then it's not really something ethical. It's like, it's not really a pretty picture, because then it could lead to some really ugly outcomes, like malnourishment and hunger, especially in like poorer countries, and for low income parts of the population, it could have some really bad and devastating side effects. So you always have to consider all these trade-offs. There is no easy option in economics. In the long run, a higher deadweight loss, larger deadweight loss for restaurants. Now, the government must raise tax revenues to pay for schools, police, etc., etc. To do this, it can either tax groceries or meals at fancy restaurants. Which should it tax? If you were the president or the king or the prime minister of a country, and you would have to raise money for a certain project, and this project is actually useful for people, like sometimes governments are not really famous for spending money on useful things, but here we assume that people that the government is actually spending money for something useful, like schools. It's a very good thing. And police, we all need police. So to be able to pay for that, which one would you choose to put a tax on, to impose a tax on? I want your opinion. Groceries. Why groceries? Do you really want people to starve? Why groceries? Yep, would receive more tax revenue from groceries. But then you may end up having angry people on the streets, not really happy with paying taxes for the groceries. Everyone buys groceries. Yeah, that makes sense. But there is also a trade-off. You must always also consider the trade-off that if you impose a tax on groceries, people would be poorer. When people are poorer, you may actually have to, like, let's say you put a 10% tax or $100 tax on groceries to recruit 100 police officers, but then because of your taxes on groceries, now more people are forced towards stealing and criminal behavior. So now you actually need 200 police officers to be able to keep the peace like before. Or schools. What good is school if people can't buy their groceries? Kids would have to drop out of schools. Even if you pay for their schooling, it's actually a crisis in many developing countries. The government is paying for their education up until university, and they're really proud of this system, but people drop out. Governments never really care about putting people on the streets anyways. Well, sometimes they care. Like, not all, like, we assume in economics, we assume that governments are actually benevolent. That's the term in economic textbooks. We have the term benevolence, that they're good natured. And of course, if you consider that, in reality, you have a much complex, a really complicated situation with lots of interest groups. Like, as a politician, I would always think about, okay, that lobby donated this much money to my campaign. These guys are my friends. Those guys ran ads against me, so they're not really my friends. I'm right wing or I'm left wing. I have to follow that way or this way. That is my base. These are not my base. But when you talk about economics, we only care about maximizing welfare, because at the end of the day, economists are the people who end up judging politicians. Politicians will always make up excuses. They're really good at supporting their friends. Like, there was a really there was a funny show in Iran when I was a little like in high school, like 15 years ago. There was this one part, it was an election, and one of them was cheating for his father. He was actually stealing votes for his father. And then when the police caught him, they said, "What are you doing?" He said, "I'm stealing votes for my father." I said, like, but that's wrong. What about the other guy? He also worked hard. And then the character says, "Yes, I understand, but he's not my father, so I don't really care." The same thing actually is in politics, but we don't care about that. At the end of the day, we want to be able to judge them from a neutral position. So that's why we focus on the outcome and maximizing welfare. So I would say it depends on the situation. For example, let's say there is a real emergency and you really need, for example, to pay for your armed forces, like when World War II happened. When World War II happened, the governments actually had to mobilize all their resources. In the United States, even gasoline was rationed. And people couldn't actually drive that often because gas was rationed, and a big portion of the gasoline in the country was sent to the army because it was necessary. But in other times, so it depends on the situation. Again, remember, there is no right or wrong answer in economics. Even if you don't consider the nature of politics, which people would take sides of their friends, I would look at someone and says, okay, he's my friend, I will support him. This, I don't know how to call this gang mentality that politicians often have. But even if you ignore it, also like if you even if you assume that people are good natured and politicians only want to help everybody, they don't care if you voted for them or if you didn't vote for them, even then there are winners and losers. So you need to be able to come up with a conclusion at the end of the day: who benefited from this policy, who lost, and how much. And this next slide will actually make the situation more clear. A bigger government provides more services but requires higher taxes, which causes deadweight loss. The larger the deadweight loss from taxation, the greater the argument for a smaller government. Like people who say, like small business owners, these people don't really like to pay taxes. They're not billionaires, but they know that if you increase taxes, deadweight loss will go up, market activity will go down, they won't have as many customers. So they don't really support big governments, usually. But then always remember that governments can actually end up spending the tax money on good things. Tax is not always something bad. The deadweight loss could end up being compensated by a really good government policy. Tax on labor income, especially important. It's the biggest source of government revenue. Marginal tax rate, it's about 40%. Wow. But how big is the deadweight loss? What do you think? Before we move to the next slide, why do you think tax on labor income is the biggest source of government revenue? Why do you think instead of, let's say, taxing breakfast cereals or hotel rooms, governments go after labor, tax every one of us who work? Even like, for example, I pay taxes. I look at my payment and my paycheck, and I can see that this much money was deducted from my paycheck as taxes. Why is that? Remember, taxes very clearly direct related to elasticities. The reason is because we all need to go to work. No matter how big is the tax, we have to work. I can't, like, my wife is in the other room right now in a meeting. I can't tell her, like, I'm not going to work this morning because the government increased taxes by 20%. It's, it's not really acceptable because then who's going to pay the rent? I have to pay the rent. So we all have to go to work, no matter how much is the tax. That's the argument that is backed by the left wing. Of course, if you look at this picture, Senator Sanders is world famous for his left wing economics. He believes that we can increase tax rate on labor because people at the end of the day have to go to work. So the dead weight loss is not really that big. But then we can spend the money on providing a really good service to them, like healthcare, which actually, like, even though I don't agree with all these positions, but this healthcare, health insurance, I think it makes sense. Like, if there's one government, it could work. It's it's really risky, but if they could if at least try it somewhere in one state or two states so we can see what happens, it could end up working. No one knows. But then the other side, the right side, they say some, Senator Sanders says some believe labor supply is fairly inelastic. It's almost vertical. Most people would work regardless of their wage. Therefore, tax on labor would have a really small difference. But the other side, the right side, they would say, no, not really. They say labor supply is more elastic, actually, because people don't need to stay in the market. There are people who are approaching retirement. If, for example, if I raise their taxes and raise their taxes and raise their taxes, they would say, okay, one morning they would say, okay, you know what? I've had enough. I'm not going to work. I will retire. This situation becomes more severe when I tax those who are working, take money from them, and then add it to the retirement benefits of those who are not working. Therefore, I'm actively pushing people to retire. This actually happened to my parents. My mom was a high school teacher, and the government kept increasing taxes on those who were working, so her taxes kept rising and rising and rising. But then the retirement suddenly became really good, like really great, actually. So my mom just retired. She said, okay, just if that's what you want from me, if you don't want me to go to work, I won't go to work. I'll retire. So that makes sense. They say labor taxes are highly distorting. Some group of workers have really elastic supply. They don't have to go to work. Another example, parents with young children, like uh, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, especially women with young children, you need to, like, someone needs to take care of the young children. And it used to be solely the job of the women to do that. So uh, if the if the mother couldn't afford to pay for childcare, or if the parents together couldn't afford to pay for childcare, mother would have to stay home and raise the children. Now it's not really like that. It's more about who can make more money. If either of the parents can stay home and raise the kids, that's fine. Otherwise, they have to, like, pay for childcare. Many workers can adjust their hours. Some families have second earners. some discretion over whether and how much to work. For example, let's say an old school family 50 years ago, 30 years ago, the father would go to work, the mother stays home and raises the children. But then, let's say the mother is also working, so they have to pay for childcare. They have to hire someone to take care of the children when they're working. If the taxes on the mother's salary keeps going up and up and up, at one point the mother would says, you know what? It's not worth it anymore. Instead of paying someone else to take care of my kids, since it's no longer profitable for me, I would stop working. I would take care of the kids myself. Because there is an opportunity cost involved in working, especially for, as I said, people with young children. The opportunity cost is much higher. Not only they have to go to work, they have to talk to their boss, they have to look at that coworker they don't really like, and we all know that like sometimes working is not really pleasant, but also they have to pay for childcare. So many of the elderly can choose when to retire. People who are approaching retirement, they have a decision to make. And if the government has a really fancy retirement program paid by labor taxes, the government is actively pushing people, retire, which could be not really good. Some people work in the underground economy to avoid high taxes. That's also something that could happen. Like, for example, in Iran, construction works, if you hire Iranians, they have to pay taxes, you have to have your paperwork. So what happens is that in construction work, especially in my hometown, employers often hire illegally, and they would hire immigrants, they would hire, even if they hire like citizens, they wouldn't do it officially. They would go towards underground cash payments. There is no bank account involved, something that the government can follow. It's all cash changing hands. So it's not that simple. If you think you can increase taxes to pay for all these social welfare programs and people will just keep paying taxes and thank you, not that simple. People will still thank you for enjoying those services, but they will do their most to avoid paying taxes. Let's look at here. We talked about increasing taxes. Now let's talk about decreasing taxes. A cut in federal income tax rates in the United States right now would lead to higher national income within 5 years than without tax cuts. What are they saying? They're saying that if you cut taxes because you reduce debt weight loss, you would encourage people to work more. And then when people work more, they end up paying you more taxes. So by cutting taxes now, this is the policy that the Trump administration right now is following. They're saying that if we have tax cuts, we can increase activity in the market, we can incentivize people to work more and more and more. And not only people would be richer and happier by eliminating their debt weight loss, but also in 5 years, because they're all richer now, they'll be able to pay us more taxes. Higher national income. Everybody will be richer within 5 years than without the tax cuts. As you can see, almost half of the people asked agree, half are uncertain. They're saying that you can't really predict like that. Lots of things could happen, like for example, the coronavirus crisis could happen, and upend everything. And 9%, they would disagree. They would say no. Most economists agree with this. And I think when we talk about higher national income, this makes sense because if you reduce taxes, and we actually saw this in after 2006, after the tax cuts were passed in the Senate, you actually saw the economic growth lifting up, and people became richer and richer and richer. But at the same time, government debt went up, which is a really bad thing. Effects of changing the size of the tax. As the tax increases, deadweight loss increases, people would leave the market. Tax revenues initially increases because people are paying more taxes. But then because there is no one left to tax, after a while, people keep fleeing from the market and there is nobody left to tax, then it would decrease. If I increase taxes to 100%, there is no one left to tax. Everybody would run away. The higher the tax, it would drastically reduces the size of the market. You can see here, initially the tax is T per unit. If you double it to double T, your deadweight loss will be bigger, causing the deadweight loss to more than double. You increase your taxes by 100%, but your deadweight loss actually was increased by more than 100%. And if you keep raising taxes to 3 times, then you can see that there's nobody left in the market. Everybody's gone. Causes deadweight loss to more than triple. That's why we need the optimal amount. When tax rates are low, raising them doesn't cause much harm. Lowering them doesn't bring much benefits. When tax rates are high, on the other hand, raising them is very harmful and cutting them is very beneficial. And right now, the battle, the main political battle in the United States is based on one side is saying that taxes are really low, so we can afford to raise them just a little bit at least. The other side are saying taxes are too high, raising them is very harmful, and different economists have different opinions about it. Revenues and the size of the tax, as you can see, when the tax is small, increasing it causes tax revenues to rise. When the tax is larger, increasing it causes tax revenues to fall. The Laffer curve shows the relationship between the size of the tax and tax revenues. We want this point. This is the optimal point, the maximum point. As you can see, when you increase tax size, first your tax revenues increases. After it reaches its peak, this is the optimal point. Everybody, I hope you can see this. This is the optimal point, this point here. First, we increase, so our tax revenue would increase as well. But then we'll reach a point like this. This is our maximum. After that, if we keep raising taxes, people are just fleeing because people have already fled. Our tax revenue will only go down. So there's no point in increasing taxes after this point. We will have less revenues. And that's why some people saying that people keep fleeing from California or New York. But then again, there is always the question of who has to pay for the government services, who has to pay the military, who has to pay the police, who has to pay the schools, who has to pay the hospitals, the social services, the courts, the judges, the lawyers. All of these people need to be paid. Government employees, the DMV, all these people, they need to get paid. A cut in federal income tax rates in the United States right now would raise taxable income, not national income. Taxable income enough so that the annual tax revenue would be higher within 5 years than without the tax cut. No economist agrees with this. Why? Because even the most optimistic economists are uncertain. Everyone else is almost positive that you cannot encourage that much economic growth if you increase taxes. Especially why? Because we learn later that when government reduce taxes, they still have a lot of mouths to feed. All these soldiers, all these police officers, all these hospitals, all these schools, all these government employees, judges, all of these, they need to get paid. So the government would have to take debts. They would have to borrow money from other countries, from private sector, from all these other people. Like right now, especially because of this COVID crisis, the United States is under enormous debt. Still not really a problem because the country is like the most highly technologically advanced country in the world, the biggest economy, the most efficient workforce. Things are already manageable, but if they keep doing like going this way, this could lead to a point where things go bad. So you can't really talk about taxation without considering debts. Debt and government debt is a topic that we'll have to study in the latest, like in the last weeks of the classes. That's our monetary policy in the last weeks. So we'll come back to this. For now, just remember, if you increase taxes, people would leave the market. No one likes to pay taxes. And the elasticities, these are the important topics. All in all, this is a very important chapter, but it's not complete until you consider government debt. Any questions? If there's no questions, you can leave. If there is a question, you can stay and talk to me. Otherwise, see you on Thursday if you're not busy. Okay. Questions.
Hi, I do have one question.
Yeah, go ahead.
So for the homework, I know Cengage has been like weird. So I did chapters 1 through 6, but for some reason it looks like it deleted my chapter 5. Like it's showing that I didn't actually do any of the problems, but like I'm almost certain I did. I mean, I can go back and do it again, but I didn't know if there's any way for you to check and see.
I can't see that. I mean, like,
Okay.
it's your account. So you're saying that you like solved the question, but it didn't document it, or could be?
Yeah, like I went through like and I did all of chapter 5 like a couple weeks ago, like when we did chapter 5. But then I was like going through and checking my grades and it like says I still have a 0, like I didn't do it. So I
Never
think I might
heard
have to
about.
redo it. I guess it just didn't save it.
I don't know. Like, I've never heard about this. I mean, if you don't press the button, well, it's not saved. So
Yeah, because I've done it before where like I'll do a couple problems and then you can like go out and come back in. I don't know. I just thought it was weird because like it has my chapter 6 saved, but like not 5.
yeah,
So
if I remember, you have to like save your progress and you have to actually submit your homework.
okay, yeah. I don't know what happened, but just thought I'd ask.
Yep.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Any more questions? Not. Thank you. See you on Thursday.